There we go. Welcome to our TMN Tuesday August webinar. This month we have a wonderful guest speaker that's going to talk about community ponds management and educational activities that the Master Naturalists can engage with their local community ponds on. Before we get started with our webinar topic, we always want to go through a quick tech check, especially for those that are new to our TMN Tuesdays events, which I saw quite a few in the chat, and so welcome. We're happy that you're here. If this is your first TMN Tuesday, do not worry, you are intentionally muted and not able to share your video. We have over 250 attendees already on for today's webinar, and we want to make sure that we're giving our speaker the due attention and the platform to be able to share their content with y'all today. If you've now gotten to slide 3 with me and you are saying, I can't hear you, Mary Pearl, I can't see your slides, or I'm having tech issues, the first one that you'll want to check is our audio, your audio and video settings, or your audio settings, and check that up in the top left-hand corner. Of course, you can't hear me telling you that, but hopefully you're reading this slide and are checking that your speakers are turned on, they're plugged in, your output volume is turned up, and that you have every wire connected where it's supposed to be connected. So I'll give this one just one more second. And if you are still having tech check issues, we do have a hotline that you can call, and I'll put that line up here in just a second. So if you're not able to unmute, how are you supposed to ask questions for our speaker today? We're going to use the chat. And to help us keep our chat in a common setting, we're going to ask you to change the to everyone, so that everyone is participating in the same group chat today. But to help Michelle and myself as moderators of our chat, please try to use the best spelling and grammar that you can, avoid acronyms, but also help to keep the chat on topic and professional and respectful, so that we can make sure that we're giving everybody a chance to ask questions for Dr. Sink today. And then last little bit of tech check here. This is our call center. So you've gotten to this point in the presentation. Hopefully everything's working for you. And if not, we do have this phone number on our website, on your emails, on the screen now, so that you can get some additional help. All right, just one more thing before we launch into what is a TMN Tuesday, and then share a little bit of program updates. Our webinar etiquette, as we always share, today is being recorded, and it will count for advanced training for our Master Naturalists, and you can see the information there on how to log your advanced training credit with your VMS admin. That chat function, as mentioned, is open for on-topic, professional, and respectful discussion today. And again, you as an attendee is not able to unmute. Additionally, as part of our TMN Tuesday events, we've begun to add in these post-event surveys. These help us to gather information about the setup for today's event, your participation in the webinar, and so on. These are voluntary, and they will take you to a survey that is hosted by Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. We'll bring this slide back up at the end of today's presentation as well. So if you don't catch it now, we'll bring it back up later. All right, Michelle, will you give us this intro?
So our TMN Tuesday events are brought to you by the Texas Master Naturalist Program. Our program's mission is to develop a core of well-informed volunteers who provide outreach, education, and service dedicated towards beneficial management of natural resources and natural areas within their local communities for the state of Texas. If you are not yet part of a Master Naturalist chapter, but want to be, we welcome you to become involved at any time. Our trainings typically take place, our chapter trainings across the state typically take place each fall and spring. And you can locate the chapter nearest you on the map and on our website there. And there was a question in the chat earlier, who can attend these? As a reminder, our advanced training events, the TMN Tuesday advanced training events are open to anyone and everyone. You don't have to be a Master Naturalist already to be attending the advanced training events, this one in particular. We also record these events and they're available on our website the following day. Our members can watch the recording for advanced training credit as well. We have these, we hold the TMN Tuesdays monthly on the second Tuesday of every month. You can see we're here on August 8th today, and then the rest of our meetings coming up for this year. There is a slight shift for October because of our annual meeting that is taking place the following week, our typical second Tuesday of the week. And that October meeting training will cover all of our Master Naturalist chapters who are presenting a project. You can register for everything in the series. You can register for everything in the series ahead of time. So everything that is still remaining on our agenda for the rest of the year, you can go ahead and register for those now. You'll get reminders from our WebEx system as each event approaches. You'll get reminders the day before, a few days before, and then the day of. So please, if you'd like, go ahead and register for everything that's coming up yet, and you won't miss a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And since our last TMN Tuesday, one of the big things that has taken place is our annual meeting. Registration has just launched late last week. And so again, this is an event that any of our Master Naturalists and Master Naturalist wannabes or soon-to-bes can attend. It's open to all. We typically have between 400 and 700 Master Naturalists from around the state and partners attending the annual meeting each year. So our registration is open. Things are filling up fast. And to find out more on the agenda, oh, there's a skeleton agenda. Thank you. Skeleton agenda, it's a 4-day event. We have over 100 different sessions, like on-site sessions going on throughout that. And then I've lost count on how many field sessions that we've have because we keep adding also. So that's another new development in our annual meeting agenda. So if you've already registered or if you weren't able to maybe get on your first priority field session, we have added a couple more. So if you want to go in and look at your registration, or if you haven't yet registered, keep that in mind as we are adding to the agenda as we're able. Our early registration is open now for a little bit of a reduced rate now through the end of August. On September 1, the rate does increase a little bit and is open through September 29th. We do have guest options available. So if you often travel with a friend and want to add a guest or attend different add-ons, we have those options available also. One of the special and new and different things we're doing this year at the annual meeting is a complete day where almost a full day where we take our entire registrants, a entire number of registrants out to the field for our El Sal's field day at the El Sal's Ranch. And the big attraction there is the opportunity to view the eclipse that is taking place. And then we also have several field stations. We'll do lunch and snacks and other activities out on the property. So.
Oh, I did not update this slide. This is last month's slide. But Todd is going to be Dr. Sink is going to be at the annual meeting and is also going to be hosting one of the field stations at the El Sal's Field Day. And so we wanted to bring him on as a TMN Tuesday speaker, have him share a little bit of his work that he does and some resources for Master Naturalists to engage in community pond management and education programs. And then he will also share some additional resources, some hands-on activities when we get to the El Sal's Field Day. And I'm not going to give away too much of what he's going to do when we get there. But he and Brittany Chesser will both be one of our field station hosts at that event as well. So, introducing our speaker for the TMN Tuesday August event, Dr. Todd Sink is our aquaculture extension specialist at Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. He's also the director of the A&M Aquatic Diagnostic Lab. And then last but certainly not least in our eyes, he is part of our Texas Master Naturalist State Leadership Team, my supervisor, and hopefully a dear friend of lots of Master Naturalists as he does many programs and is always at the annual meeting. And so we're excited to have him as a TMN Tuesday presenter this month.
Thank you for that, Mary Pearl and Michelle. So
absolutely.
Let me jump over here and share my screen.
You should have it now.
Okay.
Do you see it now?
Yes, but for some reason it shrunk my screen.
It's okay. You should have, I see your slide deck.
Okay. So now do you see the full screen?
Yes, sir. Okay. You're ready to go.
Thank you. Sorry about that. All right. So today, Mary Pearl came to me and asked me to present on management activities and educational events for community ponds. And so what she really asked me for was things that Master Naturalist chapters around the state could do for their local community ponds and how to better manage them. And so I agreed to this and I said I would do this, but then after I agreed to it, I was like, well, how do I make this happen? How do I make this work? And the reason why this is a tough question and a tough topic to talk about, pond management's actually, kind of difficult because it's often quite expensive. Most community ponds, such as, your local parks, even state parks or HOA parks, don't have a very large budget, if they have any budget at all, for pond management practices. Not to mention, most of our management often requires heavily specialized equipment that not everyone just has laying around. So when thinking about how I'm going to present this today, I came up with, first, I'm going to start by showing you guys where you can get some resources. So we're going to cover a bunch of resources that are offered by the AgriLife Extension Service and talk a little bit about those. Then I'm going to dive into a little bit about pond management activities and some common misconceptions. Because often when we talk about pond management, that's the hardest issue, is correcting all the misconceptions that are out there. People oftentimes hear things that they do in terms of management, and they're like, well, why do you do that? Well, I don't know, because Grandpappy just did it that way, and his pappy before him did it that way. Well, why did they do it? Well, if you don't really have an answer, it's not science-based, we don't know what we're doing. So oftentimes correcting those misconceptions is the first step. Then we're going to talk a little bit about pond ecology. And the reason why I'm doing this is just to give you a little bit of background. And hopefully what it does is it gives you the information so that when we get to the end and we start to talk about the management activities that you can do, it makes sense why you're doing those management activities and how those can be relayed to the public to make sense in an educational event. And so now that I've kind of given my little overview here, let's just dive right on in. And so first up is, what are some of the resources that are available for you? So first off, one of the biggest things, and most people don't think about this immediately, when it comes to pond management, oftentimes 60 to 70% of pond management is actually aquatic vegetation management. It's either invasive species or native species that are becoming over dominant into a pond. They're becoming problematic. Most people don't realize that aquatic vegetation is the #1 cause of fish kills in the state, because overgrowth can cause oxygen depletions. It can also cause things like cyanotoxins, which can cause fish kills. So the first resource I'm going to direct you to is our aquatic vegetation management site. That is Aquaplant. So Aquaplant, all one word, .tamu.edu. Now this website has everything that will help you. We have more than 240 species of common aquatic plants in the state of Texas on here. It will help you through photo guides and ID guides that have different characteristics of the plant, help you identify the plant you're looking at. It will give you management activities for that plant if it needs to be managed. It will tell you if it's native or invasive. It can even give you propagation. Sometimes these are good beneficial wetland species that we want to propagate and restore. And so it covers all these different aspects of aquatic vegetation management. The next one is our pond management website, and that's real simple as well. It's just fisheries.tamu.edu. This is where you go if you have a question related to anything covering fisheries. So if you got a question about maybe you had a fish die off, or you have a question about water quality, or you have a question about how to just better manage the fish in your pond, or fertilization of your pond, or what to feed your pond. All those, or how to stock your pond. All those are different materials that are covered on this website. The last one is our aquatic diagnostic laboratory. It's actually through the fisheries website, so fisheries.tamu.edu. There's a tab at the top that says Aquatic Diagnostics Lab. This is where you would go if you have any questions related to anything water quality. So the Aquatic Diagnostic Lab is the only fish disease and parasite diagnostic lab in the state of Texas. So if you have a disease or fish kill issue, send samples in and we're the ones that diagnose it. But we also do water quality samples from around the state to determine the suitability of a body of water for a fishery. And if it's not optimal, then we recommend amendments in order to correct it. So if you have things like you need to clear a muddy pond, you need to clear a muddy pond, or you need a lima pond, or you need a basic water quality to correct alkalinity or hardness or something. That's where you would send a water sample in to have that analyzed. Okay. So pond management activities. So what kinds of things were we talking about master naturalists doing? Well, first of all, I want you guys to focus more on educational events, not necessarily the management itself. Reason why? Well, TMN chapters generally won't be performing pond management activities themselves. Why? Well, it's very expensive. And we don't expect you to be out there spending your money and your resources to manage a public pond or body of water, right? I've figured this out very early in my career, and I tell people, many people think that ponds are holes in the ground that you fill with water. And I tell them it's simply not true. Ponds are holes in the ground that you fill with money. Because as soon as you correct one thing, there's going to be another expense that pops up, and there's going to be another expense and another expense and another expense. So you're just going to keep throwing money at this problem. Okay. So when we look at the types of management activities you normally do with a pond, all right, fish stocking. That's going to run hundreds of dollars per acre. Aquatic vegetation management, that can run thousands to even, or hundreds to even thousands of dollars per acre. Some of our, for example, herbicide treatments to treat things like filamentous algae or cyanobacteria might run $1,200 to $1,500 per surface acre. So very expensive. Water quality amendments, like these people here are applying lime to an acidic pond in East Texas to correct the water chemistry. Once again, that can run hundreds to thousands of dollars per acre. And so we're not expecting master naturalists to be out there doing these types of management activities that are coming at a great cost to them, right? Okay. Now, one of the big issues is park systems typically have an annual budget of only a few $100s per year per pond. Many of them don't even have a budget for their water body. Now, I work with various park systems. I work with Katy Park Systems. I work with the Fort Worth Park Systems. Unfortunately, they actually have more budgeted per acre in gas for mowing of lawns than they do for per acre of water in their park. You know, something that you think would be a key feature of that park. And the fact of the matter is, a lot of our park systems just don't have a lot of funds, so they have to do the best they can with what they have. So we're going to focus on group education geared toward community management. So in other words, we're going to focus on some of those activities that you can do that don't cost a lot of money, but you can also get the community large involved with management and assist you and help out the park system itself. Okay. So next, we're going to talk just a little bit about pond ecosystems. And this is one of the first mistakes that most people make. They assume that a pond is a natural ecosystem and they want to replicate a natural wetland somewhere. Well, there's an issue with that. Ponds are not natural ecosystems. They are completely man-made systems. You need to understand that first and foremost. So, for example, there's only one natural lake in the state of Texas. That's Caddo Lake up in northeast Texas. But when we look around the state today, we have 1.3 million ponds in the state of Texas. Um, that is a lot of private ponds and impoundments. When we look at that, traditionally Texas is a very dry, very arid state, but because we've dug so many ponds, primarily for livestock watering and recreational uses, that we actually have 22% of all privately owned water in the United States is within the state of Texas. So we have a lot of ponds out there, but remember, none of them existed 250, 300 years ago. We have dug all these. These are artificial systems. We basically are making giant outdoor man-made aquaria. And for those reasons, it's things like, ponds don't always have natural flow cycles through them. They're not constantly being filled. Sometimes we have to do things like add water through well systems. We have to do a lot of management with them. There is no such thing as a balanced, self-sustaining pond system. Why? Because they're artificial. We made them. All ponds of any nature are going to require some form of annual maintenance and management activities in order for them to remain healthy ecosystems. And a common misconception that people often have is, that as soon as they dig a pond, we need to put some rooted vegetation in there. And I'll be the first to tell you that fish in ponds do not need rooted aquatic vegetation in any way, shape, or form. We'll dive into this more, but I'll dispel all the myths. They need it for food. No, they don't. They need it for oxygen. No, they don't. They need it for cover habitat. No, they don't. And here in a few minutes in the slide, we'll get into this, but keep these types of things in mind where people always try to go to, oh, it's a natural wetland ecosystem. Well, I hate to tell you, but if you go to Bass Pro Shops in Katy, if anybody's been there, there's a big concrete bowl out in the parking lot that has a perfectly viable fishery in it. It's 100% lined with concrete. There's not a plant or anything else in it anywhere. And we host kids fish events down there all the time because it has a great thriving fish population. They don't need rooted aquatic vegetation. What ponds do need are phytoplankton. Now, phytoplankton are plants. They're not rooted vegetation. They're not vascular. They are single-celled little algae that are out there floating around that gives your water kind of a light green tint, not those big nasty filamentous algae mats. But they are far more important because they are the basis of your pond's food chain, and they also produce 80% of your pond's oxygen. Okay. Another common misconception, many people practice catch and release on their ponds. In a lot of city parks, HOA parks, other community parks, have fish harvest restrictions on them. In other words, they don't allow harvest. Well, that is a major problem for small impoundments. Any management of a small pond, which is, remember, once again, not a natural system, requires harvest of predatory fish. If you don't, you end up with issues such as forage collapse because the overpopulated and consumed all their forage, or you end up with lack of food and stunning. So you end up with a pond just chock full of fish, but all of them are the same size and none of them get any bigger because there's not enough food to grow. So let's kind of dive into some of these misconceptions we've kind of hinted on here. And so one of the common misconceptions is, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So like I said earlier in the presentation, it's more difficult for people to unlearn the myths, stereotypes, of bad information than to actually learn good management. If you can get people to unlearn what they think they already know right off the bat, you're going to be way ahead of yourself. So the number one misconception that I get is clear water is desirable, and there you can say it's many different ways. A lot of people just say it's good water, but you can say desirable, productive, indicator of good water quality, and that is a complete falsehood. So the food chain starts with plants, and in a pond ecosystem, that means phytoplankton. Remember those little algal cells that I said give it kind of a green tint? Well, if you have perfectly clear water, that means there's no food within that water column. And so your pond is severely undernourished. In other words, it's not producing enough food to sustain healthy fish and other animal populations. So the way in which the food chain in your pond works starts with the phytoplankton, which captures sunlight through photosynthesis and creates sugars. Those are then consumed by zooplankton and invertebrates, which are consumed in turn by larval and bait fish. And then they're consumed by forage fish. And then finally, those are consumed by predatory fish and other animals. So when we take this a step further, let me, before I give this example, let me give one real quick example. A lot of people like a clear pond because they want to be able to see that fish swimming 12 foot down. That way they know exactly where to cast their lure, right? They can cast that lure and it falls right in front of that fish. And why does that fish swim over and pick it up right away? Well, because that water is so clear, there's not enough food in the water column. That fish is probably swimming around there starving, looking for something to eat. And then here comes your lure falling like food from heaven, dropping right in front of its face. Of course, it's going to go over there and eat it. It's starving. But that doesn't mean that clear water is good for your pond. So let's get into this analogy. Most people know what that is. That is a fallow field. And because this is Texas, I'll use a lot of cattle analogies because a lot of people get cattle production. So if we have a fallow field that's been dissed and there's not much vegetation in that, how many cows do you think you could graze on that field? Not many, right? You might be able to graze one really skinny cow, but you're not going to get very many cheeseburgers or ribeyes off of that, are you? Okay. Well, now take a look at this field. This field is the equivalent to having green water in your pond. Do you think you could graze a few more cows on that field? Yeah, you can probably grow a whole lot more cattle, and you're going to get a whole lot more cheeseburgers and ribeyes. So clear water is not good water. In a pond system, what we want is green water. What does green water get us? Well, green water, because all that phytoplankton, gets us lots of zooplankton. Zooplankton are those little invertebrate animals, many of them are insects and crustaceans, that are what feed your primary fish population. So that feeds all your larval fish, everything from largemouth bass and catfish, as they're all juveniles, to it feeds some species all the way through adulthood. And so that's why we really want green water, not clear water. Clear water is not good for ponds. Okay, so when we look at water clarity, the optimal visibility in a pond is about 18 to 24 inches. So if we have a good phytoplankton bloom, that green water, then we should only be able to see light penetration down to about 18 to 24 inches. And it's very interesting that here's where two different lines of research converge. Most people didn't realize until many years later, we knew how deep water penetration should be for good productivity. Well, a different study years later found that largemouth bass feed most successfully at 24 inches of visibility. Those two things coincide. Why? Think about largemouth bass. They evolved as shallow cover shoreline-oriented predators. So if you have clear water and it can see a bluegill swimming around 6 feet away, well, that means the bluegill can also see it. And so it's going to have a much harder time closing that distance and successfully having a prey capture event when they can see each other very well. Well, reduce that visibility through phytoplankton to 24 inches, and all of a sudden that bluegill's swimming along, and all of a sudden he pops up and he's 2 foot away from that largemouth bass. And now all of a sudden they see each other. Well, that largemouth bass only has to cover a 2 foot distance real quick, and he's got a successful feeding event. So that's why we're not always looking for clear water. Now, a lot of people equate clear water to water quality. Well, this is a misnomer because water quality is not always seen, smelled, or tasted. Most times you cannot tell anything by the color of the water if it's good quality water or not. And so when we're talking about water quality, let's just address that misnomer as well. It's not really water quality, is it? What we're talking about is water chemistry. Okay? When we're talking about water chemistry, we're talking about things such as hardness, alkalinity, salinity, pH, dissolved gases, heavy metals. So you can have up here on the right, you can have things that are chemical issues, like in this picture right here, you see all these dead minnows. This is a chemical issue, alkalinity. Even though that water is fairly clear, we couldn't tell that was going on without performing tests. But water quality can also be biological in nature. If you look at the photo in the upper right, those are cyanobacteria growing on the water. So that is a natural organic issue that is going on. Okay. So when we talk about organisms in the water, we talk about things like bacteria, diatoms, algae, zooplankton. Um, One thing that many people don't think about is the effects of water quality on both our livestock and our companion animals. As you can see down there in the bottom right, that is a picture of a cow that has drank from a livestock pond and it has died because it had cyanotoxins in the water produced by cyanobacteria or blue-green algae is what more people have heard of. Um, they can produce those cyanotoxins that are neurotoxins that can cause immediate death. And when you find a livestock that drops right at the edge of the water, it probably ingested neurotoxins. Many of you might be aware of in Austin a few years ago, there were severe cyanobacteria outbreaks that killed several dogs in dog parks there in town. So we have to worry about not only water chemistry, but also organisms in the water. So clear water in itself does not mean good water. I should add, I kind of cut that off. The place where all of the dog deaths were occurring was occurring near Barton Springs. And if you guys have been there, you know how clear that water coming out of Barton Springs is. It looks like it should be really good water quality, right? But the fact is, it had cyanobacteria growing in it, and it was creating toxins that were killing companion animals. Okay, our next common misconception is that fish need rooted vegetation. And I get it for all kinds of reasons. People say they need it for food, shade, cover, habitat, oxygen. Well, let's look at some of these. Food. Do they need it for food? The answer is no. None of our common pond species eat aquatic vegetation. If they did, we wouldn't need to bring in things like grass carp from Asia or tilapia from Africa for aquatic vegetation control. Our native fish would do it. But the simple fact of the matter is none of our fish eat it. Um, Conversely, aquatic vegetation actually interferes with our native fish species obtaining food. So if you look in the bottom right, that is a picture of hydrilla, a non-native invasive species that grows very, very thick. How does a largemouth bass successfully find and capture prey in that? Um, what it does is actually can cause predator avoidance is what it's called, the term that it's called. Predator avoidance means that the smaller bait fish are all hidden up in the vegetation, so the predatory fish cannot hunt effectively, and therefore they will not grow, and you start running into population problems. Um, those people that say, oh, they need it for shade, okay? Well, let's take a look at that. Well, fish are what are called poikilothermic. That is a fancy scientific term that means they are the same temperature as the water they are in. Okay, so shade does not significantly change the temperature of water or the fish. So if you have because of the thermodynamic properties of water, it takes about 7 times more energy to change 1 gram of water 1 degree than it does a gram of air. Um, in other words, if you have a tree casting a shadow over a pond, there's not going to be really much measurable difference in water temperature from that shady area to the sunny area right next to it. Heat transfers very well, very easily through water. So it all kind of equalizes out and you're going to get about the same temperature. So shade's not really cooling that fish in any way, shape, or form. The other thing is, why would a fish want to be cooler? Because they are poikilothermic and they don't generate their own endogenous heat, they rely on external heat. So if they are cooler, in other words, if they cool down, that means their metabolism slows down as well. And they are slower. They can't swim as fast. They cannot avoid predators as easy or obtain prey as easy because they are moving slower. A fish wants to be as fast as possible in order to maintain a high metabolism, in order to have adequate fast growth, and be able to escape predation and obtain prey. Okay. Okay. In a small body of water, a lot of people say that fish need it for cover or habitat. But here's the thing, in a small body of water, shoreline depth change is both cover and habitat. So do small fish need vegetation to avoid being preyed upon by large fish? No. The answer is they just move shallower. Okay, they move to shallow water where larger fish can't hunt. They're using that depth change as their cover and their structure. Now, this is probably the biggest reason why we do not want too much aquatic vegetation in our ponds. Rooted vegetation is a major cause of fish kill in ponds. The reason why is everyone knows that it produces oxygen during the day when it's photosynthesizing, but no one thinks about what's happening at night when the sun goes down. Okay, there can be as much as 8 to 14 tons of aquatic vegetation per acre, and all of that is still living tissue. So when the sun goes down, it still has to breathe. It has to respire, which means it's consuming oxygen. So all night long, it's consuming oxygen and it's sucking all the oxygen out of the water. What that can do is lead to low dissolved oxygen fish kill. In other words, most rooted vegetation is actually a net consumer of oxygen. Yes, it produces some during the day, but it consumes more at night than what it produces during the day. So in turn, it's a net consumer. What we really want is that phytoplankton. Again, we're going back to those little unicellular algae. They are what produces 80% of your pond's oxygen. The other 20% comes from the atmosphere and surface diffusion. Okay, the next misconception, fish need deep water. Okay, some people say they need to stay cool, which we've already talked about. There's no reason for a fish to cool off. They don't want to be cooler. That makes them slower than the other fish around them, and they don't want to be eaten, and they want to be able to successfully catch prey. So they don't want to cool down. Many people say they need sanctuary from predators. No, 6 foot of depth is sufficient to avoid most terrestrial or aerial predators. Show me many birds that are going to be able to dive beyond about 6 foot in a pond and successfully catch prey. It just doesn't happen that much. Another thing is when you think about what are most of those fish being preyed upon, it's the smaller fish that are the most susceptible. Well, going deep for little fish generally means they get eaten by larger fish, so they don't necessarily want to go deep. So deep water is not necessarily needed for fish. Another thing is too much deep water causes issues for the pond itself. It can lead to what many of you might have heard of a turnover, but don't really fully understand what that is. Well, too much deep water leads to turnovers. The big issue is many times when people are constructing ponds, they don't have a lot of land. So you might only have say a quarter of an acre area in which to construct your pond. So many people, in order to make up for lack of total surface area, in other words, they wanted an acre pond, but they only got a quarter acre area, what do? Well, they're like, but I dug that sucker 32 feet deep. Well, that's not good. That's going to set you up for fish kills pretty much every fall. A turnover event results in low dissolved oxygen fish kills because it undergoes what's called stratification during the summer, and it forms an anoxic layer at the bottom that contains no oxygen. And then in the fall, when those temperatures equalize and the water mixes, it drops the oxygen out of the pond and you get a low dissolved oxygen fish kill. Now, this can be hard to visualize and conceptualize for a lot of people, so I'm trying to explain it here in a diagram. So here we have 2 different ponds, and both have 1 surface acre. The one on the right is dug at appropriate depth of about 14 feet. That's about where we want it. We want 10 to 12 would be ideal, but we'll go 14 here. Over here on the left, we have the same 1 surface acre, but we dug this sucker, like I said, 32 foot deep. We're making up for that. So obviously it's got a lot more volume than the pond on the right, but is that a good thing? And is it usable by the fish? Okay, so let's take a look at that pond during the summer. Well, most ponds, light penetration due to turbidity from things like clay, phytoplankton, organic debris means that light penetration in most ponds is only going to be between 6 to 8 foot deep. Okay, and so if the sunlight is penetrating that upper 6 to 8 feet deep, upper 6 to 8 feet, that means it's also heating the upper 6 to 8 feet. So What we know about water is when you heat it, it becomes less dense. Okay, it also holds less oxygen, but because you're heating it at differential rates, it can actually change viscosity and it will actually separate and form layers. So this is where we get the term stratification. That upper 6 to 8 feet is going to be heated quicker, and that water becomes less dense. And then we get what's called a thermocline. What a thermocline is the boundary layer that exists between two different temperature layers of water. So the surface water is much warmer, it's less dense. Then we have the thermocline. It kind of forms a seal or a cap below the or above the bottom cooler layer of water that is much, much denser. Okay. Now here's the issue. That thermocline basically forms a physical seal. It does not allow this water that is below the thermocline to ever come in contact with either the atmosphere to get oxygen or the phytoplankton. Remember those algae? Because where are they at? They all have to be up where the sunlight penetrates for photosynthesis, so they would not be below the thermocline where sunlight does not penetrate. So all summer long, the oxygen down here is being depleted. There's no oxygen in this bottom layer. Okay? So what happens in the fall when the air temperature starts to cool down and that surface layer starts to cool? Well, eventually it cools down to the point where it gets to about the same temperature as the bottom layer. And then you get this rapid mixing. Okay. And because this one over on the right was dug shallow at an appropriate depth, it had a little bit of anoxic layer of water on the bottom below that thermocline, but not very much. In terms of the volume of the pond, it's no more than about 25%. So even though it's mixing low oxygen water with the rest of the pond, it's not that much and you don't get any fish kill. Over here on the left, though, more than 2/3 of the volume of this pond, because it was so deep, was down in that anoxic zone where there's no oxygen. And suddenly, when you get that rapid temperature mixing, then all of a sudden it drops the oxygen out of your pond. It goes below 4 parts per million, and now your fish can't breathe, and you get a low dissolved oxygen fish kill. So the optimal pond depth in Texas is an average depth of no more than 10 to 12 feet deep. This is deep enough to resist water fluctuation because in the summer, remember, we do get evaporation. We get heavy rains during the spring and winter sometimes. So, you know, you're going to have 2 feet of fluctuation up and down, but it keeps that 6 to 8 foot depth really nice. So that's about where water stratification is. Because remember, below that thermocline, the fish can't actually swim down there and use that water during the summer. Remember, it has no oxygen in it, so the fish are not living below the thermocline. It's unusable water. Okay, another common misconception in ponds are that fish have to eat every day. Well, that is not true. They do not have to. Remember, fish are poikilothermic. They're cold-blooded, temperature of the environment. That means they have very low energy needs. They have 80 to 90% less energy requirement than mammals or birds do because we generate our own heat. They do not. And so, for an example, in catfish aquaculture, once water temperature drops below 50 degrees, we don't feed. There's no point. Their metabolism is slow. They're not growing. They're not putting on weight. So feeding doesn't do any good. Okay. Now, here's the other thing about being poikilothermic. Fish do not have to grow if there's insufficient food. They will undergo what is called stunting. Um, and so what that means is you can have these long, skinny fish that have enlarged tails, enlarged eyes, long, skinny bodies, and they're all about the same size. Well, those are signs of a stunted fish. And so oftentimes people make the mistake of thinking high numbers of fish present in a pond means that there's a healthy fish population. Well, that may not be true at all because if they're all about the same size, they're stunted, there's not enough food. The reason why is because there's too many mouths, which is why the high numbers for the food present, and so you end up with stunning. Remember, in a pond, those fish, when they run out of food or oxygen, they cannot leave that bowl to go somewhere else to get more food. So food and oxygen availability determine the carrying capacity of your pond, which is also why, like I said, management of small ponds requires harvest of larger predatory fish. Okay, the next common misconception is presence of many small fish means sufficient food available in a pond. That's not necessarily true. Lots of small sport fish. Fish may be stunted at a small size. That's an indicator of insufficient food. If you have lots of small bait fish, um, one of the issues is fish do not chew their food. Because think about, like our largemouth bass or catfish. Do they have like large cutting teeth like sharks where they take chunks out? No, they don't chew their food. They swallow it whole. So that means the mouth size determines the prey size. And so you have to have sufficient size prey for every size of fish in your pond. If we look at this photo on the right that matches up these prey items, okay, if we look at the bottom, the bluegill on the right, on the bottom three, say you have a pond full of those small bluegill, well, hey, that's great. These little bass over here on the left have all kinds of food to eat. They're growing well and doing really well. The issue is, what does this great big guy up here on top eat? Um, in order for him to chase down and catch these really small fish, he's burning more energy than he's getting from them. It's kind of like me walking 2 miles to pick up a popcorn kernel. I'm going to burn more energy attempting to get that food than I'm going to get from the food, and I'm going to end up losing weight. Now, if you make it a double cheeseburger, now it might be worth me walking 2 miles to get that because now I'm getting sufficient calories from a larger food item. Okay, conversely, say we look at the two larger bluegill on the upper right, say you have a pond full of those size fish. Well, hey, that's great. Your big fish have plenty to eat and they're growing good, but what do your small bass down here eat? Well, the answer is they're not eating anything because their mouth is too small to get these larger bluegill in, and so they won't be growing. So you need to, just because you have large numbers of fish in your pond does not mean you have a healthy population. You need to make sure that you have prey and forage sizes for every size of predatory fish in that pond. Some other common misconceptions. I need to add bass to my pond every few years. We get this quite often. Um, Oftentimes, the best bass fishing in a pond is going to be between 7 and 10 years after you initially stock it the first time. Why is because most bass in the South live to about 8 years of age and they're indeterminate growers. They grow their whole life. So by the time they are about 8 is when they're the largest they're ever going to be. So that's why you have great fishing. After that, it starts to go downhill. So people often think, well, I need to stock more bass to make it better. Well, the issue is the reason your bass fishing is going downhill is because you probably haven't kept up with harvest. You need to harvest more of those bass because remember, there's a finite amount of food in that pond. And if you harvest more bass, that leaves more food for the remaining bass in the pond to grow larger and grow faster. By adding more mouths to it, by stocking new bass, well, you're just further diluting that food even more and you're cutting down on your growth. This kind of ties in with our misconception number 7. I should practice catch and release. Well, we tell pond owners, no, you need to practice catch and eat. Reason why we need harvest from small ponds. The primary management strategy for ponds, for all ponds, no matter your management scenario, whether it be the maximum fish sustainable yield, the trophy bass option, the trophy bluegill option, black crappie option, all of these management strategies revolve around harvest of largemouth bass and other predatory fish. Why? Is because there's not enough natural mortality in a small pond is all usable habitat. So fish tend to overpopulate in those situations unless you are out there harvesting on an annual basis. Okay. So like I kind of already addressed this, the first instinct when fishing in decline for most people is to stock more fish. You need to stop, take a step back, and then determine what is it? Is it food issue why I'm not having good growth? Not necessarily that I need to stock more fish. Okay. Like I said, remember, pond is a bowl containing finite amount of food. Fish can't leave that pond to get more food when they run out. So when it comes to managing a pond, let's talk about the ecosystem real quick because it doesn't really matter what it is our pond goal is for it. If your goal is fish and managing a fish population, you may be a bass fisherman and you want to catch lots of big bass like this. Okay. Maybe you don't care anything about bass at all, and you're a pan fisherman, and all you want to do is catch big bluegill like this. And when your bluegill start having foreheads, I'll tell you, those are pretty good sized bluegill. I like to catch a few of those. Maybe you're a cat fisherman and you want to string your catfish to take to the freezer. Um, all of this applies, but realistically, what are most of us as master naturalists probably going to do? We're out there talking about managing community ponds. We're managing for the community, right? We want to see family scenes like this or youth fishing events. This is really what our goals are of these community park systems and these community ponds. But regardless of what our management goal is, what we want to catch or do with it, the pond ecology remains the same, and you need to understand it in order to do any type of educational activity with it. So the first thing that you need to understand is, what is it we're growing out there in the pond? Okay, in other words, are we growing the cows and goats of this system? Are we growing herbivores? No, we're not. None of our fish, like we said, eat aquatic vegetation. Okay, what are we growing out there in the pond? Well, what we're growing is we're growing the coyotes and the bobcats of the system. We're growing the carnivores or the predators. So the real question becomes, how do you develop a strong food chain in your pond? Well, like I said, the food chain starts with plants, and I know many of you are going, well, he just said that, none of our fish eat plants. Well, that's true. They don't, but the food chain still starts with plants. Now, in our aquatic ecosystems, though, rather than being grass or leaves, our plants are this. What that is one drop of pond water that has about 20 different small algal cells in it. Those are phytoplankton. These are little single-celled, free-floating algae cells out there in the water, and it's out there in the pond. This is a zooplankton, okay? This is basically the cow of our system. These are our grazers, okay? And so this one is a Daphnia. I chose a water flea here because many people know what that is, but a lot of them look like little crustaceans, little shrimp. Zooplankton come in all different sizes and shapes. But they're out there drifting around in the pond. And so the zooplankton runs across the phytoplankton and it eats that. In turn, the zooplankton then feed all of our bait fish, which in turn feed all of our forage fish. And eventually it feeds that big 10-pound largemouth bass everybody wants to catch. So how do we get that strong food ecosystem? Well, the answer is pretty simple and it's pretty cheap. This is a management activity that somebody can do for their local community pond for a few dollars per acre. It doesn't get much cheaper than this. So how do you get a green field? Well, you fertilize. Well, how do you get a green pond? You can do the same thing, you fertilize. On terrestrial systems, nitrogen is the most limiting, but in aquatic systems, phosphorus is the most limiting. And there's a very simple reason for this. Phosphorus is heavier than water. It sinks. So it basically precipitates out where it's locked up in the pond bottom and those algal cells up in the water column can't get to. So when we're talking about fertilizing and you look at your bag of fertilizer, we're talking about that middle number. Those three numbers you see stand for nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. We want that middle number. We want a high middle number. Okay. We're looking for liquid and granular fertilizers containing 20 to 36% phosphorus, or we're looking for powdered fertilizers with 50 to 60% phosphorus. And so over here on the right, we have two common pond fertilizers that you can buy. We look at the middle, this top one, 48% phosphorus. This bottom one's 52% phosphorus. So those are really good fertilizers to use. Okay. Next question is, most people ask, well, how much fertilizer do you need per acre? And the true answer is, I really can't tell you. You need to have a water quality test performed to determine what the phosphorus level present is. But I've seen literally thousands of water reports from across the state of Texas, and I can tell you that most ponds in the state of Texas require between 5 and 8 pounds of phosphorus per acre in the spring to kick off a good bloom. Okay. Now, these are really good pond fertilizers that you can buy, but they're labeled for ponds. Because they're labeled for ponds, that means that they automatically charge 10 times more for them, when in reality, they're nothing different than you can pick up at most of your local farm and feed stores, your co-ops, anywhere where they sell agricultural fertilizer. So you can go to like your local co-op farm and feed store, and we're looking for things like ammoniated polyphosphate or orthophosphate, or triple superphosphate. You find any of these, $25 will get you enough to fertilize a couple acre pond for the next 15 years. Now, up to this point, we have talked solely about inorganic fertilizers. Those are man-made fertilizers that are derived primarily from petroleum products. But they're not always the best, because what they do is they cause this boom bust cycle in your pond. In other words, when you add those fertilizers, all the nutrient is available at once. So you get this big phytoplankton bloom, it takes off and get exponential growth. And then all of a sudden it gets such a high biomass, it runs out of nutrient and you get a crash. And so it will repeat that boom and bust cycle. That's not necessarily the healthiest thing for your pond, to have that boom and bust over and over. So what we can do is take a note from what we've been doing in the aquaculture industry since the 70s, start using organic fertilizers. One really good organic fertilizer that we like to use is cottonseed meal. Reason why, it's a byproduct from another industry. It's widely available because it's an animal food stuff. People use it for cattle, horses, other things, because it's high protein. It's high in phosphorus, but it's a plant product, right? It's a plant material. And what is plant materials made of? Cellulose. Well, what breaks down cellulose? We don't digest it very well. Most things don't digest it very well. It's broken down primarily by bacteria, which is kind of a slow process. So you can take that cottonseed meal, apply it around the edge of the pond, and as that bacteria breaks it down, it slowly releases phosphorus to the pond environment over time. So you don't get those big boom and bust cycles. You get a more gradual, sustained release of fertilizer or nutrient going into that pond. Okay. So why would we fertilize our pond? Well, it's simple. We can increase the fish production 4 to 6 fold by simply undertaking the task of a few dollars of fertilizer per acre. If we look at an unfertilized pond, the typical unfertilized pond can sustain about 75 to 100 pounds of fish per acre. Now, some of you are probably thinking, well, that sounds like a pretty good fish fry. But you got to remember, that's fish of all sizes. Okay, so we know that there are many, many more times small fish in a pond than medium-sized fish. And there are many, many more times medium-sized fish in a pond than there are large-sized fish. So out of that 100 pounds of fish, there might only be 2 to 3 pounds of harvestable sized fish in that. Well, now if we take that same body of water and now we begin to fertilize it, suddenly it can support 250 to 600 pounds of fish per acre based on food production. That's a big increase for a few dollars per acre. Now, there are some caveats when we talk about fertilizers, though. Do not fertilize rooted vegetation, okay? If you have rooted vegetation already out there in your pond and you fertilize, what do you get? You get a whole lot more rooted vegetation, and that's a problem, right? We don't want that. So this is why we recommend to people right from the start, as soon as you dig a pond and it begins filling with water, start a fertilization program. The reason why is not only does it boost the food and oxygen production of your pond, but it also suppresses the rooted aquatic vegetation growth. Why? It acts the exact same as pond dyes. If anyone's seen when they dye ponds that blue color, that's to block sunlight to prevent aquatic vegetation growth. Well, by fertilizing the pond and getting that bloom out there, all that green color, it's doing the same thing. It's blocking sunlight, preventing it from reaching the bottom, and you can prevent aquatic vegetation from becoming established. Okay? The other thing is, do not over fertilize. Go slow when adding. It's okay if you only add a pound or two at a time. Wait a week, see what kind of bloom you get. The issue is you can't take it back out once you put it in. And we don't want to over fertilize, because then you could actually cause a low dissolved oxygen fish kill. So go slow, don't over fertilize. So how do you determine if you have a sufficient bloom in your pond? Well, the answer is this fancy scientific tool right here called a Secchi disc. And that's that little black and white plastic disc on the bottom. Now, I'm going to tell you, do you need one of these tools? No. You can get one for about $30 to $35 off the internet, Amazon, or where else. But in reality, that black and white line don't mean anything. All you need is the white. Okay, so can you make one of these at home? Yeah, We use 1 gallon paint can lids. We spray paint them white. Or you can use an old pie tin, spray paint it white. You can even use a white fishing lure as long as it's white. What's important is how you use it. So what this tool is we're lowering it down into the water and we're looking at that outer edge of white. And when it gets to the point where that outer edge is fuzzy and we can't make out a nice, clear, distinct edge, okay, you're deep enough. Now we start to slowly raise it up until we can just make out a nice, crisp, distinct edge. Then you measure how deep it is. That's why we have this one attached to a yardstick. Some people put them on strings and measure the string afterwards. If you're using a fishing lure, you can just pinch your fishing line at the surface and pull it up to see how deep it is. That is what's called the Secchi depth. That is a measure of water clarity. Okay. So if you have 18 to 24 inches of visibility, you have a good bloom. Perfect. You don't need to fertilize. You're right where you are, where you need to be. If you can see greater than 24 inches down into that pond, you need to fertilize the pond because A, it's not as productive as it is. You're not growing the fish you could be. And you're also going to have rooted vegetation issues because you've got sunlight penetrating more than 2 feet deep. And it's going to lead to booms and plant growth. If you have 12 to 15 inches of visibility, it's too dense. Do not fertilize anymore. Wait until you get back up to around 24 inches of visibility before fertilizing anymore. Now, if you have less than 12 inches of visibility, you have accidentally over-fertilized and you should probably get some emergency aeration because you were probably looking at an oxygen depletion one night that week. Once again, do not over-fertilize. Okay, so what does all this work fertilizing get us? Well, like I said, it gets us zooplankton. Zooplankton are those tiny floating insects and crustaceans that are out here. And most of them, they're not truly microscopic because you can see them with the naked eye. Most of them are about a millimeter in length, which is visible. So in other words, if you cup some pond water in your hand from a pond and you look down into it and you see little things moving around, those are zooplankton. And so what this jar here on the right is, all that is I took 1 gallon of fertilized pond water and poured it through a filter, a sieve, and it retained all the zooplankton while letting the water go through. And then I just put it into this clear jar so you could see. And so this is all the food that is being produced by those zooplankton in 1 gallon of pond water. And you think, well, that doesn't look like very much. But when you take 1 acre foot of water, that is 1 acre. So you got a 1 acre pond, the top 1 foot of it, that is 325,851 gallons. So multiply this amount of food by 325,851. That is a lot of food out there for your fish to eat. And that's just the upper foot of water. So what does that zooplankton get you? Why is that important? Well, it's important because it's what feeds all of our small sport fish like these bluegill up to about 2 inches. It also feeds our little baby largemouth bass up to about 1.5 inches. Okay. Now, there's a whole nother class of food out there in the pond, and that is called detritus. And detritus is basically just dead organic material. It can be plant or animal. Typically in ponds, it's mainly plant material. As you can see, all this is a sycamore leaf that has fallen into a pond. If you look at the left half, that it's kind of clear and doesn't have all this growth on it, that was below the soil, below the pond sediment. The stuff on the right was exposed. You see the stuff that was on the right has this kind of gray-green ooze growing over the top of it? Well, that is periphyton. Periphyton is a mixture or an ooze of bacteria and algae that are breaking down that organic material and releasing the nutrients. So why is detritus important? Well, it feeds in another entire class of food out there in your pond called detritivores. Now, detritivores are very critical because they are things like invertebrates, crawfish, insects, worms. So think about some of the most important fishing lures of all times. If you've ever fly fished, you've imitated a detritivore. If you've ever flipped a jig for a bass, you've imitated a detritivore. You're imitating a crawfish. Who didn't probably, first fish they ever caught was probably a worm under a bobber. Well, you were using a detritivore. Why are detritivores important? Well, that's because that's what feeds For example, our largemouth bass, from the time that they're about 1.5 inches and they switch off zooplankton, that's going to feed them all the way up to about 12 inches when they switch over to a diet of piscivory, which means a diet consisting primarily of fish. They're also important because it's what's going to feed your bluegill and your red ear sunfish for the rest of your life. Bluegill are insectivores, so they're going to be eating insects the rest of their life. And red ear are they eat primarily snails and mollusks the rest of their life, which are detritivores. So those are all important. So when we talk about our pond food chain, I have this set up in terms of growing a 1 pound largemouth bass. But most people, big fishermen would, you know, I'm going to change the scale on this. I'm going to put this as a 10-pound largemouth bass. The reason I'm doing that is a true wall hanger. That is a true trophy fish. And this is what it's going to take to grow one trophy fish. So to grow one 10-pound largemouth bass, it's going to take 100 pounds of bluegill. Okay. Again, for that 10-pound largemouth bass, it's going to take 1,000 pounds of zooplankton, worms, insects, and crustaceans. It's going to take 10,000 pounds of algae, phytoplankton, detritus, and periphyton. Now think about it. Does your pond have that much production for just one fish, let alone hundreds of fish that you want to grow? That's why building a strong food chain in a pond is so important. I realize that we're running pretty far behind here, so I'm going to skip some of these things here and get to some of the activities that you all can do. So TMN management activities. So what are some of the types of educational events that you can do to both educate the community and get them involved in management of your ponds? Well, some of the first one is help them study pond food chains. Help them understand the stuff I just went over. These are pretty simple things that you can do. Things like plankton tows. You can get this little net like this with a collection bottle, throw it out in your pond a few times, drag it along. It will drag in all the zooplankton that are out there, and you can look at under a microscope and show people what these little fish are eating or what the effects of the fertilization is, what you're producing out there in that pond to get this food. You can also look at your Secchi depth and your water turbidity to determine how sunlight is affecting that food chain. Seining. Seining's very simple. For less than $70, you can have a very good seine setup. But seining is a good way to get people involved with fish population sampling, to understand what is actually out there. Most people won't ever see any fish other than one or two that they might catch. Seines catch all kinds of different species of fish in all different sizes. So you can look at things like species diversity and relative abundance, species age and size structure, and even species relative weight. Those are all things that can easily be accomplished with two people in a seine. Okay, what are some other things you can do? Well, water quality monitoring. Water quality is applicable to everything. Water quality affects anything that requires water to live, and most of us, as you know, require water to live. So it's very simple, low cost, low budget. You can get Hawk or Hanna sample kits, and you can do educational activities on water quality for fisheries management. You can also look at invasive or undesired species management. This can include both monitoring and detection, in other words, out there seeking it out, but you can also do removal activities. There are so many park ponds around Texas where we show up to that are just chock full of invasive species, and they don't have the budget to manage or treat those species. So just getting a crew out there for a few hours to manually pull weeds for a few hours is a great asset to that park. You can also do seining, cast netting, dip netting, and fish traps, and this are other ways to monitor for invasive or undesired species. Using these methods, you can find things like unwanted vegetation, fish, or even invertebrates. We are having things like apple snails and other invertebrates show up places we don't want. So what are some of the actual hands-on management that you can do out there? Well, one of the big things you can do is manual vegetation removal. We've already covered that. Nuisance or invasive species. You can work with park staff to implement fish regulations that include harvest. And part of this is just education of the park staff, because oftentimes they set a release-only policy simply because they don't know any better. They think they're protecting the resource, but in turn, they can actually be harming it. what we really want to do is harvest some of those predatory species, leave the forage species. And so explaining educational events to the park staff may actually improve that resource for the community. Like I said, it's very low cost. You can implement fertilization to enhance the food chain and fish production. You can do water quality monitoring and detection again. Native vegetation restoration and shoreline stabilization. This is something that it can easily be done. You can find native beneficial vegetation around the state. You can propagate yourself in tubs very easily. But how many times have you been to a park where just due to foot traffic, there's been worn trails all around, there's exposed roots, exposed shoreline that's creating runoff issues, bank cutting, it's creating muddy or turbid water? Well, it's very simple for us to get out there and actually plant some of our native beneficial vegetation to restore some of those areas, and that will in turn help protect water quality. In addition, another way to protect water quality in terms of clarity and nutrient addition is to either plant or develop or talk to your park staff about implementation of buffer strips for nutrient management. A lot of times our parks will fertilize things like sport or recreation fields right adjacent to ponds. We don't want those excess nutrients ending up in our pond and causing, like, for example, cyanobacteria issues. We can always do structure development, and these include things like wood and rock. Think fish attractors for the general public. One of the great things that I tell people to do, and it's free, around New Year's, I like to drive around my neighborhood with a trailer, and when everyone's throwing out their old live Christmas trees, I will stack every one of those Christmas trees I can get on there. And what I do is I go to Lowe's, get a 5-gallon bucket, I line it with Crisco so that the mold will pop out. I stick the base of a Christmas tree in there and pour half a bag of Quikrete in there. What you just did was make a tree anchor, and you can go out and plant underwater forest in clumps of 6 to 8 trees at various locations around, and you have just made great fish habitat that will attract and hold fish, and that is a great resource for the public. And so with that, I skipped some stuff. I've been trying to go quick. I went a little long today. But with that, I'll open it up for any questions. And sorry, Mary Pearl.
Todd, I had no expectations that you would meet the time slot. You always have way more information than time allots for, which is a great plug for Todd's presentation at the annual meeting as well, where he'll have even more time to ask and answer questions for you guys. So as you've been talking, we've had a number of questions come in. I've tried to collect some. There are way more questions than what we will potentially have time for today. So I'm going to ask just a few of these. Specific to aquatic vegetation, there was a lot of discussion in the chat about non-fish organisms, turtles, ducks, other non-target fish species, and how you're using the model of your predatory fish species as a management indicator, and then how do those indications and those management strategies then portray out to your other non-target species?
Wow, there's a lot to unpack in that question there.
Sorry,
there's a lot of different ways you could go with it. So one of the big things is, honestly, what is your management goal? Now, if you come to me and you're wanting aquatic waterfowl habitat, I'm going in a completely different direction. I'm going with, shallower ponds that do include a lot of vegetation in them, because that vegetation will also hold things like macroinvertebrates, which are going to attract waterfowl and other things. The reason why I went in this direction, fish specifically for today, we're talking about community ponds. Okay, we're not talking about someone's backyard pond. These are city public park ponds and those things. Most times those want to be aesthetically pleasing. Most HOAs do not want waterways that are choked full of vegetation, have algal mats, those types of things in it, so that it's very unpleasing aesthetically to a lot of people, right? A lot of naturalists, we don't care about that. We find beauty in that, right? But so if you were going in one of those directions, yes, there's different things that you can do based on your management goals. And so some of the things that we do recommend for waterfowl, and I'll just go down that, widgeon grass is a great species. American pondweed, Illinois pondweed, these are all native species that have seed heads that migratory waterfowl rely on. They're eaten by other species such as turtles, red-eared sliders, stink pots, turtles, scoters. So yeah, it really does depend on what your management goal is. Like I said, I kind of went with the fish strategy today because most park ponds, it's either going to be either purely aesthetic with no fishing involved, or it's going to be a fishing pond. Um, so yeah, we can get different scenarios and different answers, but I understand there's limitations based on what we're doing.
Yeah, so master naturalists should start off with a conversation with their city parks and rec, the community pond, to help
Absolutely,
to
yes,
understand goals, and then outline a projected plan based off of what those intended goals are, and
absolutely.
understand the maintenance from there.
And I think you'll be surprised when you go to talk to most parks that they do not have a plan or a management goal for ponds. They have, and I find that truly amazing because overall, in terms of management, they know what they want to do with the park. They know its intended use is what they want, but water features are often overlooked. They don't specifically have any type of management plan in place. So it's really a blank slate for you guys to go in and start working with a lot of these neighborhoods. They want the help. They don't necessarily have the funds for it or know what to do, but you guys can basically go in and help them make that plan, figure out what their goals are.
Speaking of water features, there was a couple of questions and scattered throughout, so I'm going to generalize here, asking about the role of artificial circulation devices to help offset oxygen loss or oxygen consumption at night by some of the plants. And can you talk about the role that artificial circulation and oxygenation devices may have?
Sure. So first of all, remember, like I said, ponds are a completely 100% artificial environment. It's a man-made environment that we're making. And I gave the analogy, we're kind of making a giant outdoor aquarium. Well, when you put a water circulation device in there, you're basically putting a giant artificial air stone in there into your aquarium. Um, Most ponds, if properly constructed, do not need them. I do not recommend them in 90% of the time. If you drive across the state of Texas, like I said, there's 1.3 million ponds in the state. There's very small percentage of those that have any type of aerator, water circulation device, Fowden. Um, those are typically not needed in any way, shape, or form unless there's already an outstanding issue with your pond. In other words, it's constructed improperly. One, it's too deep, so it does stratify, and you have to put in some type of bottom diffuser to keep it mixing so that you don't get turnover events. The other is it's been constructed too shallowly, and so you don't have adequate water volume, so it runs out of oxygen. Or three, you have not kept up with maintenance and there's too much vegetation. Um, those are the scenarios where you may need a water circulation device and aerator. You guys are correct though. When they said run it at night, I tell people all the time they mess up with their aeration. If you get an aerator there's a couple ways to get about this. One is a lot of people will buy those windmill aerators. Well, when do you need aeration the most? You need it at night when there's no photosynthesis, there's no oxygen generation. What happens on a hot, still night during the summer? There's no airflow. It's just dead, right? So you're not getting aeration at night. Um, the other thing is people, when they buy an aerator, the mechanical, they run it 24 hours a day. Well, you have a maximum, think of your pond has a maximum oxygen cap. Well, if you run it 24 hours a day, all you've done is you've moved that cap up a little bit, and eventually the fish and plants will grow to that cap again. What we want to do is you only run it at night when the oxygen is in depletion, when there is no sunlight, no photosynthesis. Kick it off in the morning when at dawn, because now your plants take over and they're producing oxygen. That way you're not artificially inflating that oxygen cap, and your pond will not outgrow its oxygen capacity.
Great. I've got one more question, and Michelle, if you've got any questions that you've seen in the chat, I don't want to keep folks for too terribly long, but there's been a couple of questions about resources. And Todd, you shared some links at the beginning of the chat, or the beginning of the presentation. I've put those in the chat, and we'll have those links on our website as well. But there was questions about where can I find freshwater test kits? Where can I find information on pond construction? where can I find additional information on resources that may be available to connect with my community pond if they don't have resources for management? Can you talk about the teams that go into all of the different resource teams and organizations and resources that are out there for master naturalists to look into?
Absolutely, and that's really what we need to talk to the teams, because a lot of these are handled by very, very different people. For example, you can call Extension and talk to Brittany Chesser, our aquatic vegetation management specialist, and her website, the Aquaplant, that we've already been over. She will help you out with any type of aquatic vegetation, any algal bloom issue, anything you need. You can talk to an aquatic specialist like me that can help you with anything fish related, water chemistry, those types of things. Pond construction, you guys brought that up. That's a whole nother team. So one thing is, you call us, we're going to pass you on to someone else. There is a federal agency that is tasked and funded with pond destruction, design, and repair. That is the Natural Resources Conservation Service, the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. You can go to their website. Every state has a state website. They have the national website too. They have several very good pond construction and maintenance manuals on their website. But one of the great things about NRCS, they're made up of soil scientists and civil engineers. I went to school for fish biology, those types of things. We don't necessarily learn the soil and stuff. They're all civil engineers, soil scientists, and many of their services are free. So you can call them up if you're looking at building a new pond on your property. They will tell you the best place to site it, if the soil type there is adequate has 30% clay to support the water structure for that. They will help you move around. They will, based on the watershed in the area, they can tell you what size of pond can be supported there. So the Natural Resources Conservation Service. When it comes to things like wells, the Texas Water Resources Institute is where you would go if you want information on wells. So there is a lot of information out there, and I know that it can be really, really overwhelming. So that's why I direct a lot of people to our fisheries website, because from our fisheries website, that is one central point where you can get to the Aquaplant website, you can get to fish management, you can get to the Aquatic Diagnostics Lab, you can get to NRCS, you can get to a lot of different places. So that's one great resource that you can go to. That's kind of a generalized starting point. I'm talking so much and going so fast, Mary Pearl. Did I answer all the question? What else do I need to add in there?
Water test kits.
Water test kits. So you can make this as complicated or as simple as you want. You want a good quality water quality test kits, go to either Hach, H-A-C-H, or Hanna Instruments, H-A-N-N-A Instruments. Those are two really good water quality testing companies that produce any type of water quality testing kit. They have generalized ones, like they have the Fish Farmers kit that comes with like 8 different tests in it that you can buy, and it's 100 tests of each one. But if you're just doing an educational thing around your community, there is nothing wrong with going to a pool supply store. You can get pH, alkalinity, hardness, chlorides, total salts. You can get those from either a pool store or a pet store. Think about how specialized the testing supplies are for your aquariums. We're measuring the same thing in an aquarium that we need in a pond. So you can get those. They just tend to be a little bit less expensive, not quite as precise, but they give you a good overall idea of what the water chemistry there is present, and that's good for an educational event.
Thank you. There's a few other questions, Todd, and we are running close on time, so I'm going to ask maybe one more question here, and then any additional questions, if there's a chance that you'd be willing to answer some of those through text, we can put that on our website. And then there's also been a request for your slides, and if you're willing to do so, then we'll share that on our website alongside your recording. Great. One of the questions that we've gotten a few times is about nutrient load and specifically eutrophication. So the off run, and my apologies because it's been a while since I've taken my fish class, but the runoff of nutrients and the play between what's happening on the land uphill and then how that is impacting pond management and nutrient values in the water column.
So that is one of the biggest issues that we face and have been facing it for the last 100 years. Um, Nutrient runoff from the landscape. Um, and and how do I say this? It can be everything from severe, from golf course and agriculture fertilizer runoff to petroleum product runoff from parking lots to something that is less severe and or less harsh, I guess you say, that people don't necessarily think of, just cattle feces on the landscape where people are grazing cattle. But one of the biggest things is from the day you dig a pond and it first fills with water, that is the day that it has the least nutrients it will ever have in its existence. From that point on, it only accumulates nutrients into the point that it becomes a shallow wetland and completely fills in. Um, Ponds are what we call a nutrient sink. And so it's a really bad problem in that this is why we are constantly combating all the aquatic vegetation problems, why we're having this big increase that we've been seeing the last 4 to 5 years in national outbreaks of cyanobacteria and cyanotoxins. All of it is due to eutrophication and incoming nutrients. And so that's why a lot of what we focus on is um, making sure that we have adequate buffer strips. We don't have bare exposed soil in and around ponds. We use a lot of nutrient binders in ponds nowadays. But what we've really gone to is we've kind of turned to nature to start combating the problem itself. Um, we have a lot of new products on the market in the last 5 years that are all natural bacteria products where microbiologists have went around the world looking at freshwater bodies, looking for organisms that naturally digest plant materials and cycle nutrients. And they brought those back and cultured them. And now we have different blends of bacteria that do all these different cool things in ponds. But we're actually adding a lot of bacteria and they cycle the nutrients. They put them back out into the environment. And so they're basically eliminating them from your pond system. So it gets rid of all the algae issues, gets rid of all the plant issues. So there's a lot of different things that we can do, but unfortunately, we need to really start looking at limiting the use of fertilizers on the landscape a lot more than we currently are. And the good part is agriculture is really catching on to that. And they have been since the 90s. The places where we're seeing it the worst, though, is like HOAs, where everybody has to have the greener yard than the neighbor next to them. Um, I tell you, those are some of the most nutrient polluted ponds that we deal with are the HOA ponds.
I'll tell you that my yard is not green. It is brown and dead and ready for seeding this fall.
Mine's just dead from no water, so it's run
Exactly.
off because there's not been water in so long.
Exactly. Well, Todd, it's nearly 1:30 and we're going to let you go. But thank you so much. You've gotten a lot of kudos in the chat. And so I'll share those as well as some of the questions that we didn't get to in the chat, and then have the recording and the resources that you've shared posted to our website, if not later today, first thing tomorrow. So thank you. Really appreciate it. And all of our TMNs will see you at the annual meeting in just a few weeks. All right. Thanks.